Hello, this is Rajiv Talwar, and the purpose of this recording is to provide an end-to-end demo of the SAP Ariba Procure-to-Pay system. In this demonstration, we will focus on the baseline P2P functionality. We will start off by creating a purchase requisition where we add one or more items to our shopping cart and submit the requisition for approval. The Ariba workflow engine will then kick in and evaluate our requisition. Based on the requisition properties and our defined business policy, an approval flow will be dynamically generated. Next, we will view the approvals from the approver's point of view and actually go through and fully approve our requisition. When the requisition is fully approved, Ariba will automatically generate an associated purchase order and dispatch that to the supplier for fulfillment. Once the supplier has sent us our goods, the next step is for us to key in a goods receipt in the system. Eventually, the supplier will also be ready to bill us for the items they've sent, and they will send us an invoice. If the supplier is on the Ariba network, the invoice will come automatically through the network and get loaded into P2P. If the supplier is not on the Ariba network, they will send the invoice via manual means such as email or fax. Then, typically, people in your accounts payable organization who have the right permissions in Ariba can manually key that in directly into P2P. Regardless of where the mechanism for how the invoice arrives, the next step is invoice reconciliation. When that invoice is loaded, the reconciliation engine will kick in and evaluate the invoice. It will be compared to the associated purchase order as well as the goods receipts. If there are any discrepancies, we will flag invoice exceptions. As part of the reconciliation process, those exceptions are routed to exception handlers who must take the appropriate action. Once exception handling is complete, typically there are one or more additional approvals for the invoice because the properties could have changed. After both reconciliation and approvals have been completed for the invoice, it is only at this stage where the invoice is finally ready for payment. The final step of our end-to-end demonstration will be looking at the payment document that is generated once we've reached this stage. Let's begin our end-to-end process by creating a purchase requisition. When you first log into Ariba, you are brought to the dashboard screen. On the top left of the dashboard screen is a system search. You're able to search by various types of documents based on title or ID. Underneath that, you have the Common Actions box. The types of actions you see available here will depend on your system permissions. Underneath that, we have the Recently Viewed Items box. And this remembers the last 5 or so items that you have looked at, just for ease of access next time you log into the system. On the right-hand side, it's possible to have a news portlet to have any links or text to company news. Underneath that, this particular user has system tiles configured. These tiles will give you a snapshot view of what's going on with various types of documents. All users will also have a to-do box. The items you see in the to-do box are there because they've come to you because you are on the approval flow for those particular items. You could be on the flow as a required approver or as an optional approver, sometimes called a watcher. This just means that you're going to get an FYI notification and you can view the item, but don't necessarily need to take any action. Below that is the My Documents box, and this is where you will see any documents or transactions you have personally initiated. So that is the dashboard screen, and we're going to start off by clicking Create Requisition. When you do that, it will bring you to the Catalog screen. On the Catalog screen, there are many different ways to find the items you're looking for. Starting on the left-hand side, there are commodity categories. And these are based on the commodity codes that have been loaded in Ariba. Within each category, there may be subcategories where you can drill down into to find the items you're looking for. Below that, you do have the option to shop based on vendor, if you happen to know the correct vendor for your item, or if you have the permissions to even shop based on purchasing organization. There may be different catalogs available based on the purchasing organization. On the right-hand side, we have the keyword search. Here's where you can search based on part number, supplier name, or an actual keyword to find the item you're looking for. There are additional search items that are optional. These search options are by part number, material number, or manufacturer part number. You can have this box be visible or hidden. Below that, you will see a few more sections, the first of which is promoted items. This is if there are any key items promoted by your organization that they want to make available to the user base. They can be featured or promoted here. Below that, recently viewed items for your company. Within your particular company code, if there are items that are frequently ordered, they would show up here. Below that, there is a section for your own personal recently viewed items. So if there are items you personally order frequently, they would show up here just for ease of access next time. Below that, there is a similar function for recently viewed suppliers. The most common suppliers that you order from would show up here along with subcategories. Of course, as you're shopping and placing orders, it is possible to mark items as favorites. And if you do so, they will show up here. It is possible to have a folder structure for your favorites as well. Finally, you have the categories with the most items. These are the commodity groups that have the largest number of items in the system. So as you can see, there are many different ways to find the item you're looking for. I need a computer monitor, so I'm going to go over here to the JCN Technologies catalog and underneath that to the subcategory of computer input equipment. When I click on that, it will bring up any items that fall underneath that category. So you'll notice that right away it tells you there's 260 items, so there's quite a few items available. You always have filters on the left-hand side to narrow this down further. You can narrow it down based on keyword, based on the manufacturer, if you happen to know the correct manufacturer, based on price, or sometimes there's even other criteria here. And you'll notice in each case it tells you the number of items that are available in each category. Over here, you can see that we are able to sort the items also that show up based on price, ascending or descending, alphabetically ascending or descending, or based on best selling. We also have the ability to select more than one item by clicking the checkboxes and clicking the compare button. If you do that, that will give you a side-by-side comparison in case you have two similar items and you'd like to know what the differences are. I'm going to go ahead and add a sun monitor to my shopping cart. So I'm going to go ahead and click the add button. You'll notice for this item we have the supplier information, the part number, the lead time are all featured here along with a description for the item. I could actually click the item as well to see a more in-depth description. So in this case, I'm adding the item to my shopping cart, and there is my confirmation. It's generated a purchase requisition number for me, PR466, and it's telling me that I've added this to my shopping cart. Now I will go ahead and click to proceed to the checkout. And here's where I can start adding information, header level information to my requisition. So I'm going to put in a title. And I can see that since I am logged in as Alex Agassi, this order is on my own behalf. It is possible to do an on behalf of requisition and select other people. By clicking any drop down in Ariba, you will see previously selected options, as well as a search option at the bottom. If I click to search, I can go through the system and pick up any other user in this case to do an on behalf of order. I'm not going to do that in this case, but if I did, that person would show up on the approval flow because I am taking an action on their behalf and they need to be aware. To delay purchase until date, this is if I want to put in my requisition today, but not have it hit the books or go out the door until a later date. I can click the calendar icon and select a date in the future, and if so, the requisition will still be generated and still go through the normal approval process, but it will not generate an associated purchase order or send that to the vendor until we hit this delay date. Company code. This particular system that I'm demonstrating in is geared towards SAP backends. So this happens to feature a company code at the header that I could change. Labels are an optional feature. You can add labels to your various documents for help in searching later on. So if I have a project going on, I could potentially add the project name here. And that way, if I have 10 requisitions, later on I can search for that label and see all requisitions underneath that label. Deliver to, that is who the goods are going to be delivered to. And again, I'm logged in as Alex Agassi, so by default, it's put his name in for me. You notice that some of these fields have stars next to them. Any field with a star next to it is a required field. Next up is the need by date. Need by date is really just a guideline for the supplier on when you need these items. It doesn't necessarily mean they can fulfill the order by that date. And anytime you see a little eye icon next to a field that stands for information, it will bring up a little bit of information about what the field is used for. Comments. I can place header level comments here, and I can also attach any corresponding documents. Comments and attachments are available at the requisition header in Ariba and also at the line level. So it is possible to have separate comments and separate attachments based on line item. Comments by default are internal only unless I click this checkbox here to make my comments visible to the supplier. Now let's scroll down a little bit further and see what's happened here. We've added this item to our shopping cart. It is visible here. We can see again the supplier part number, the item description. Based on our commodity code mapping, we see that it's shown up here, and our vendor information. The quantity that we're ordering was editable on the previous screen, and it's also editable here. I could change that. Our grand total is here. And from this screen, I can also look at the approval flow. So if I click the approval flow button, it will show me the approval flow that's required for this item. The approval flow is based on our workflow engine, and that in turn is based on the approval rules that we've configured in the system. Approval engine in Ariba is pretty robust, and we can configure approval rules based on almost anything. Based on dollar amount, based on a supervisor hierarchy, based on commodity code, and many other criteria. In this case, we notice that it is going to two people for approval, Kirk Stabler and Jared Madden. If I put the mouse over Kirk's name, you can see that it gives me a reason why he's in the approval flow. It says that my supervisor must approve. So I don't have the approval authority for this, so it is going to Kirk as my supervisor. He does not have sufficient authority, so our chain rule is going up to the next level to Jared Madden. You can see it says chain of command. Jared does have the sufficient approval authority, so the approval flow stops there. I cannot remove any of these people from the approval flow because they were added based on our business policy. But I am able to add people by clicking the triangle on the location where I want to add somebody. If I click the triangle, it will give me the option to add the approver in serial or in parallel, and I will have to specify who I'm adding, whether they're a required approver or a watcher, and I need to provide an approval reason. That's the reason you see when you mouse over an approver's name. Once you do that, you will see the additional box get added to the approval flow. Scrolling a little further down, we have the line item section we saw before. And I'd just like to show you, you have some actions available here. I can go through and click the actions button, and you notice I'm able to copy this item. I'm able to delete this item if I've added it by mistake, or I can add details or edit my details. Let's go into the detail view so we can take a look. First of all, you'll see that we have the item details. Since this item came from a catalog, you notice the description, the part number, and the pricing are not editable. And that certainly makes sense because a catalog has our pre-negotiated items and pricing, so they should not be editable. Underneath that, we have the commodity code that this item is mapped to, the vendor, and some vendor contact information. Based on the vendor, there is a default payment term that has come in for me as well. So the top section is just your line item details. If we scroll down to the next section, that is our accounting. Accounting in Ariba is driven by a number of things. First of all, every user has a user profile, and that user profile will have the user's default accounting in there. So that is one way we can drive accounting. The second is based on commodity code. So based on the item that I have put in my shopping cart, we saw that it mapped to computer data input devices. That is the commodity code. Within our commodity code mapping file, we may have that in turn mapped to certain accounting combinations. And so you'll notice that all my accounting has defaulted for me. These are all editable fields, and I could go into the individual searches and search for other items, but it has defaulted for me. And again, this particular system is geared towards SAP systems, so the accounting you see here is reflecting that. If I want to split my accounting between one or more accounting code blocks, I could click the split button. And you'll see that when the split screen comes up, it will give me the option to split based on a couple of different criteria. So I can split based on percentage, which is the default. I can split based on a dollar amount, or I can split based on the quantity I'm ordering. By default, it will give you one split, but you can add as many splits as are necessary by clicking the Add Split button. No matter what type of splitting you're doing, the system will always ensure it adds up properly. So if I'm splitting based on percentage, it will ensure that it is adding up to 100%. In this case, I'm not going to do any splitting, so I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel. And that will bring me back to my line item details screen. So we saw the accounting. Underneath that is shipping. And it is possible to have separate shipping addresses based on line item. The shipping is defaulting for me based on my user profile again. So I belong to the Los Angeles office, and it is defaulting for me automatically, as well as putting in a deliver to name. I am able to put a separate need by date at the line item level as well. So these properties come in for me automatically, but they are editable. If you allow it, it is possible to have non-standard shipping addresses as well in the system. That's where a user needs to fill in a short form to key in an ad hoc address. So you can see that there's a lot of information here at the line item level. If we have additional charges or taxes, these are relatively new features to Ariba, they can be added here or on the summary screen. Charges refer to things like shipping charges and handling charges. At the bottom, we have our familiar comments and attachments, just like we saw at the header. So again, these are available at both the header and at the line level if we need to add comments or attachments. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and that will bring us back to the header level. So now we've seen what happens when you've added a catalog item to our requisition. What happens if we can't find the item we're looking for in the catalog? We can click the Continue Shopping button in this case to get back to the catalog screen. It's bringing me back to where I last left off. You'll notice there is a breadcrumb trail of how I got there, and I can click to go back to the catalog home. When I do that, you'll notice that in the upper right-hand corner, if I have the right permissions in the system, there is a Add Non-Catalog Item button. If I can't find what I'm looking for and I have the permission, I can add a non-standard item by clicking this button. When I do that, it's going to bring up a short form for me to fill out. My purchasing organization is filled in for me by default based on my user profile. You'll notice the next series of fields are required. Now, if this was a catalog item, many of these things are filled in for me automatically based on the catalog. Since this is non-standard in nature, I'll have to populate these. So I'm going to go through and put in a description. I want to order some widgets. Next, I need to specify a commodity code. If I click in here, it will remember previous commodity codes that I've used. But if I click the search, you will see that it's going to bring up the commodity hierarchy. Ariba uses UNSPSC commodity codes by default. That's the United Nations Standard Products and Services codes. They can be anywhere from 2 digits at the parent level all the way down to 8 digits at the most specific level. I can search for a commodity code based on its name or based on its digits if I happen to know what the digits are. Within a particular commodity group, I can drill down to the various levels. So you notice under apparel, that is commodity code 53. If I want to get more specific, I can drill down underneath there. Clothing is 5310. If I drill down underneath that, shirts and blouses are 531016. And if I drill underneath that, men's shirts are the most granular level, 53101602. So I can select any commodity as appropriate from here. In this case, I'm going to actually go back to the previous screen. Since it remembered a value I used previously, I'm going to go ahead and select that. So I'm going to go ahead and select my office furniture commodity. You'll notice that once I do that, it defaulted an account type for me automatically. Next up, I need to specify a quantity. So I want to order one of these items, and I'll need to give a price. So let's say they are $100 each. You'll notice that the unit of measure is each by default. That is the default for non-catalog items, but it is possible to change the unit of measure. Ariba uses UNUOMs, United Nations Units of Measure. All standard units of measure are featured here. If I click the Update Amount button, you'll notice that one item, a quantity of one at $100, will give me a grand total of $100. Next up, I need to specify a vendor. So remember, the top half of the screen is what are we ordering, and the bottom half is from who are we ordering it. So I'm going to click the supplier search, and here I see JCN Technologies, the same vendor I selected before. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And when I do that, you'll notice that the contact and payment terms once again come in for me automatically. Just like to mention that by default, it is possible to make the pricing and the vendor optional on a non-catalog item. The reason for this is because non-catalog items are routed to procurement by default anyway because they are non-standard in nature. It's up to the procurement person to decide if the item we're ordering is appropriate, and if so, they may have a better idea of who the best vendor would be and what the pricing should be. Or these fields can be made required if you want to force your users to specify both a vendor and a price. Now that I've filled out this short form, I'm going to go ahead and add this item to my shopping cart by clicking the Add button. So you'll notice that it will give me a confirmation of the second item being added to my shopping cart. So I have my previous monitor adapter that I ordered, as well as the widgets I've just added. If I click to go back to my checkout step, I'm back to my familiar summary screen. But now we'll notice a difference. The approval flow engine works dynamically. It will always look at the latest version of your requisition to see who needs to approve. If I click the Show Approval Flow button, you'll notice it's no longer just Kirk Stabler and Jared Madden. Now we have two additional approvers. So Kirk Stabler and Jared Madden were an example of a supervisor hierarchy. We've also added Facilities Manager, and that is a commodity-based approval because I'm ordering a furniture commodity. In addition, we have purchasing agent because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a non-standard item. So we want to have the purchasing agent ensure this is an appropriate item to order. So this is an example of how the approval flow can update dynamically. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the second item from our approval flow by clicking a checkbox next to it and clicking to delete this line. So when this deletion occurs, the item is gone, and you'll notice the approval flow automatically has updated based on that. So now we've created our purchase requisition, and I'm going to go ahead and submit the requisition. So I'm going to click the submit button. You'll notice my cart summary is here, letting me know what I've ordered. Click submit, and now it is confirmed for me in this green box that my requisition has been submitted. If I click to view the requisition now, again, it's issued us a requisition number, PR466, and Kirk Stabler is now the active approver. Kirk would have received an email letting him know that something requires his attention. He is able to view the item from his email and even approve it from there if we have email approvals turned on. And that also works from any standard smartphones as well as Outlook. So now I'm going to go ahead and log out as Alex Agassi, and I'm going to log in as Kirk Stabler so we can see what this requisition looks like from the approver's point of view. So I'm going to go ahead and put in Kirk Stabler's credentials. And let's log in and take a look. So Kirk has the darker theme on his account. So you'll notice it's a little bit darker of a background. You have that option. And when we log in, you'll notice in Kirk's to-do list, and his screen is arranged slightly differently than Alex Agassi's, my requisition is right here on top. The to-do list is updated. It will let us know that PR466 was submitted on today's date by Alex Agassi, and it requires my review. I can click the requisition number or the title to get into it. If I'm already aware of this requisition, I can approve it right from the screen. But if I'd like to look at the details, I can click on the requisition number, and it will bring up the requisition. I can see the header level information. I can see the approval flow to see who else is on there, and the line item information as well. If I click the detail button, it would show me the accounting on top of that. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and approve this, so I will click the approve button. And whether you approve or deny, it will always give you the option to put in comments. Certainly if you're denying, you want to put in a comment to explain why. I'm going to put in an approval comment, and I'm going to click OK. You'll notice that when I do so, that item is immediately gone from Kirk Stabler's to-do list. It is still there in his recently viewed items if he wants to go back and look at it, but it is gone from his to-do list. Now I'm going to log out as Kirk Stabler, and next I'm going to log in as Jay Madden, who is the second approver. Once I log in as Jay Madden, it will bring me to his dashboard screen, and we should see that same familiar requisition in his to-do list. So here it is. My requisition has come through, so I can go ahead and click on it. And you'll notice now that if I scroll down and look at the approval flow, Kirk Stabler's box has turned green, and there's a green check mark to indicate that he's approved. So I can see the past approval history as well as Kirk's comment. So now I'm going to go ahead and approve this as well as Jay Madden. That's Jared Madden, one of our test users. And again, it will give me the opportunity to put in a comment if I want to. In this case, I won't put in a comment, and I will click OK. And now that item is gone from his to-do list, but still visible in his recently viewed items. Now I will log out as Jay Madden, and let's conclude this by going back as our original user. So I'm going to log in again as Alex Agassi. And if I go to my home screen, it's going to show me that item and the latest status. It brought me to the catalog screen first this time because that was the last screen that I was on. But now if I come back here, I can scroll down to my documents because this was a requisition that I initiated myself. And I can see that it's now in ordered status. That tells me it's been fully approved and sent to the vendor who happens to be on the Ariba network. If I click into this, I can see the comments from the approvers. And if I look at the approval flow, I can see that both boxes have turned green and both approvers have given their approval. And there it is right here. Also, if I scroll down to the item, now I notice a purchase order has been generated with a PO prefix. So purchase order 22 has been generated. If I scroll to the top, I can look at the orders tab and also see the PO 22 featured here. This is a clickable link, so I am able to click into the purchase order and take a look at it. It always lets you know in the top left-hand corner which document you're looking at. I'm going to click back to go to the requisition and also point out there is a history for the requisition so we can see everything that's occurred. It's a full audit trail. So we can see Alex submitted this, Kirk and Jared both approved. And Kirk approved with comments. I could click here to see the comments. So this item has been fully approved and a purchase order has been sent to the vendor. To conclude this portion of the demo, we can see we also have some additional options available here. If I want to copy this order to make a similar order, I could click the copy button. If I realized I made a mistake and change orders are permitted, I could click the change button to change my purchase order. If I realize I no longer need this item, I can cancel my order, again if permitted. Or I can see a simple print view of my purchase order as well. In the next part of the demonstration, we'll be clicking on the receive button once we physically have the goods to go ahead and initiate our goods receipt. Now that we've created a purchase order in Ariba, the next step is to key in a goods receipt. At this stage, the supplier has fulfilled our order and we physically have the goods. Ariba supports both desktop receiving and central receiving. Central receiving is when you have a central receiving party, like a group at a loading dock, for example, who is doing the goods receipt for you. Desktop receiving is where the person who ordered the items is also going to be the person keying in the goods receipt. And that is what I will be demonstrating for you. In order to do the goods receipt, I can start off by clicking under Manage, the Receive link. If I do that, that will bring up a search where I can search for my purchase order and then receive against it. Another way to do the goods receipt is to scroll down to the My Documents section and look for the purchase order in question. Our purchase order is right here on the top, and I can click on the purchase order to get into it and begin receiving. When you go into the purchase order, you have a number of actions on the top that we've seen, and we're going to go ahead and click the Receive button to initiate our goods receipt. When we get to the receiving screen, it is fairly straightforward. First of all, you have your header level information from the purchase order at the top. So you have the purchase order number and its title, the date the PO was submitted, and we are in receiving status because we've just begun the receiving process. Next, we have the line level detail. We have the actual item I ordered, its description, the quantity I ordered, its part number, and so forth. If I want to do a full goods receipt, they've sent me the full quantity, I can click the Accept All button. And if I do that, that will put in the full quantity for me and jump me to the summary step so I can submit the receipt. Another way to do a full goods receipt is to put in the full quantity in the accepted box, and that will serve the same purpose. Ariba does allow partial receipts as well. If I had ordered a larger quantity and the supplier only sent me some of the items, I could come in here and put in a partial quantity. If I do that, Ariba will automatically make another goods receipt for the remaining quantity and keep it in composing status for me so I can work with it later on once I actually receive the rest of my quantity. Another thing to point out is when you do a full goods receipt in Ariba, it will automatically close the purchase order for further receiving. If I do a partial receipt and I realize I want to close the order for some reason, I do have that option right here. So in that case, I can click the Yes Radio button, even though I've only done a partial quantity, and I can close the PO in that fashion. Now, what happens if they've sent me my items and there are some items that are broken or defective? I can put a quantity in the rejected box in that case. So you put a quantity in the rejected box, and then you update the screen by clicking Update Totals. When you do that, you will see that it will take into account my rejection, and a new field has popped up, the goods return tracking number. This allows me to key in a goods return tracking number if the vendor has provided one. Please keep in mind this does not initiate any action to the vendor. You still have to go outside of Ariba and follow your normal goods return process. This is strictly for tracking purposes in Ariba. The other thing that happens when you reject a quantity, when you click Next, instead of it jumping you all the way to step 4, which is the summary, you will be required to stop at step 3, which is the additional information step. On this screen, it will have the line level information. I'm able to put in a reason why I'm rejecting. Item was broken. I'm able to send an email to purchasing to let them know that I'm having a problem with this vendor, and that will go to people in the purchasing agent group so they know this vendor is a problem. And I can also specify whether I want a replacement item or I want a credit for this item. Now, again, this is just for tracking purposes and to alert the purchasing department. You still have to go outside of Ariba to do your goods return. The other thing I'd like to point out on this screen is asset receiving. Asset receiving is optional in Ariba, but we do have the functionality to leverage based on commodity if you require asset information to be keyed in. So we can configure the system based on commodity to require asset information. If this was such a commodity, typically things like IT commodities, you can force the user to key in a serial number, a tag number, or an asset number. The other thing this does is put on the asset approver onto the receipt approval flow. So it is possible to do that, and it is possible to export the receipt data to an external asset tracking system if required. In this case, I'm going to go back to my previous step, and I'm going to take out the rejected quantity, and instead I'm going to accept all. So when I click the Accept All button, this is jumping me automatically to my summary step, step 4. This is my last step to review my receipt before I submit it and just make sure that it's making sense. Please note on this step, I can put in a comment if I need to, and I can also include attachments. The other thing I would like to point out here is there is an approval flow on receipts. In a desktop receiving model, such as this one, the only person you'll typically see is yourself, the person keying in the goods receipt. When I submit this goods receipt, it will serve as me submitting the receipt as well as approving the receipt at the same time. I don't need to come back later on and do a separate approval. It is possible, however, to configure additional approval rules if you require further approvals beyond the person keying in the goods receipt. It is also possible to manually add in approvers, as we've seen before. So going back to the Summary tab, I'm taking a look at my goods receipt. I'm receiving the full quantity. Again, by clicking the Accept All button, it brought me to the last step, put in the full quantity for me automatically. So the only thing left to do at this stage is to actually click Submit. And when I click Submit, my goods receipt is completed. It has a unique receipt number with an RC prefix, and it is now complete in the system. In the third part of our demonstration, we'll look at when the supplier bills you and sends you an invoice and how that invoice is reconciled in Ariba. For the third part of our demonstration, we are going to focus on invoicing. Previously, we saw that we had submitted a purchase order to our supplier and they had fulfilled the order. Now they want to bill us for that. If the supplier is on the Ariba network, they can do what's called a PO flip. That means they can access the purchase order on the network in their account and turn around and send us an invoice. That invoice would come automatically to our P2P system. If the supplier is not on the Ariba network, they may send us an invoice via email or fax. In that case, someone with the appropriate permissions, typically somebody in accounts payable, would manually key in the invoice into the system. I'm now logged in as Arnold Davis, who belongs to the accounts payable group, and I'm going to do just that. Regardless of whether the invoice comes from the Ariba network or is manually keyed in, the reconciliation process is exactly the same. So let's begin by creating our invoice. So I'm going to go under the Create menu and select Invoice. This will be a purchase order based invoice. And as we saw from the previous part of the demonstration, our purchase order was PO22. So I'm going to start by going into the purchase order search and search for my purchase order. I will key in the PO number and click search. Here is my purchase order. I can select it and click done. And you'll notice when the screen comes back that just by selecting the purchase order, quite a bit of the information is automatically loaded for me. So you can see that the supplier information is here, populated for me. It knows that Alex Agassi submitted the purchase order, his company code, and all the shipping and remittance address type information is here on the right-hand side, as well as the default payment terms for the vendor. Again, this is a PO-based invoice, but of course Ariba supports non-PO invoices and contract-based invoices. Now I'll scroll down to the line level, and you can see that it's also brought in my line level information. It knows that I ordered a sun monitor on this purchase order, quantity of 1, and a price of $34. So as of now, that is my total. If I were to click the little number 1 here in the accounting column, that would show me the accounting on the invoice. And if I click the details, I would see additional information. Now I am able to add additional charges to this invoice. Ariba supports all these additional charges, such as shipping, special handling, and tax, both at the header level of the invoice as well as at the line level. To submit at the line level, I would click the Add Item dropdown if I want to add additional items as well. If I click the Add Item Details, that's where I can add additional types of charges, such as taxes and shipping and handling. In this case, I'm going to submit my taxes at the header level. So instead, I'll come up here to the header, click the Add button, and you'll notice I can add taxes, charges, discounts, etc. In this case, I will select taxes, and it's going to ask me what type of tax I want to add. In North America, where I am, sales tax is the default, so we can leave it as that. But in the drop-down, depending on what we have loaded in our tax tables, you may have other values such as VAT tax, value-added tax, use tax, etc. In this case, I'm going to add sales tax, And let's add sales tax of about $4 to this invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add. And it knows it's US dollar based on my profile. And when the screen updates, you will see the taxes have been added at the header level. It is also possible to adjust the accounting for the tax line as well. As far as keying in the invoice, this is really all there is to it. Similarly, on the Ariba network, if the vendor was doing a PO flip, they would see a similar interface in which to key in their invoice. I'm going to go ahead and submit this invoice now. Please note that invoices can have approval flows. In this case, my invoice will not. And this is actually a handy tip. You notice I've not put in an invoice number, so I need to key that in. Always look at the approval flow to make sure you've not missed out any key fields. In this case, let me put in my invoice number. And now when I click on the approval flow tab, you see there's no errors. This same trick can be used on requisitions, receipts, or any other document in Ariba. Where I was going before is that invoice documents with an INV prefix, which is what Ariba adds, can have an approval flow if you want them to. We generally recommend that you do not, because that will hold up the corresponding invoice reconciliation document from being generated. When an invoice comes into P2P, it will make these two copies. One is the INV copy, and you'll notice that it kept my invoice number here in the middle. It'll put an INV prefix, and it will append a few digits at the end just to ensure it's a unique number, in case another vendor submits the same invoice number. When I click Submit for this invoice, it's only then that an invoice reconciliation will be generated. If we had approvals here, that would slow down that process a bit. So it is possible, but not recommended. I'm going to go ahead and submit my invoice, and then I can view the status of the request to see what's happening. Once you submit an invoice, you will see an additional tab called the Reference tab. And if you click on that, you're able to see all the associated documents for your purchase order. So we started off with PO22. We then did our goods receipt, which got the number RC198. We submitted our invoice, and that has made an invoice reconciliation document with an IR prefix. You can click into any of these documents from the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and click onto the IR, and you can see that we have a discrepancy. When the invoice came in, it did a three-way matching process between the invoice, the purchase order, and the associated receipts. Based on our invoice exception configuration, it's looking for various things, such as, is the tax amount appropriate? Is the line amount appropriate? Is there a payment terms mismatch? The system comes with 50 different exception types that you may use. And we police for all these things within P2P directly, as well as upfront on the Ariba network if the vendor is invoicing from the network. In this case, the system looked at our tax tables and it detected an overtax variance. That means that based on the invoice properties, we were expecting $1.36 worth of tax. However, on the invoice, $4 of tax was charged, which is too much. Therefore, we've triggered this exception. In particular, we have 4 tax tables in Ariba, and they will look for the expected amount, and if the tax that is charged on the invoice is over or under, it will flag this type of discrepancy. The tax is calculated based on where the goods are coming from, where they're being shipped to, and the commodity out of the box. Tax functionality in Ariba is optional, however. So in this case, again, we have marked a overtax variance, and we can look on the approval flow to see how this is routing. Generally, when it comes to an invoice reconciliation, you will have the reconciliation portion first on the approval flow. So if there's any discrepancies, it will route to the appropriate person to clean those up. Keep in mind this invoice will not be paid until any discrepancies are dealt with. And in this case, we're routing to the tax manager. Oftentimes, after the reconciliation portion, you may see additional approvals because the exception handler might have changed the properties of the invoice. So you may have additional or different approvals that are required. In this case, we just have the tax manager who needs to approve. So now what I'm going to do is log out as Arnold Davis, and I will log back in as our tax manager, Chad Knoll. So I am putting Chad Knoll's credentials into the system. And let's log in. When Chad Knoll's screen comes up, you can see that he starts on the invoicing tab by default, and at the top of his invoicing to-do list is our invoice reconciliation. So he would have received an email from the system and come in to take a look at this. He can click into the IR, the invoice reconciliation, to see what's going on. And when the IR comes up, he can see there is an overtax variance. He can then click the open button to actually deal with this issue. Depending on the type of exception that is triggered, the exception may be at the header level of the invoice, or it may be at the line level. Based on that, you have different options as an exception handler, based on header or line and the type of exception. In this case, you can see that there is an overtax exception at the header. So Chad has the following options. If he edits this invoice in any way, once he's done making his changes, he can click Submit. If he decides this invoice is completely inappropriate, he could reject it altogether. For an Ariba Network enabled supplier, that rejection will immediately go back over the network to the vendor. Generally, you put a comment on the rejection, and the vendor would have the opportunity to fix it if you allow them. If the supplier is not on the Ariba network, then manual intervention is necessary. The refer button is if Chad realizes that he is not the right person to deal with this or does not have enough information to make a decision. He can click the refer button, and that would bring up a user search of people he can refer this exception to. Please note that the entire user base that's loaded in your Ariba system will not appear in the search, but rather only people who belong to the invoice referral specialist group. So you need to make sure that the people who would be handling exceptions all belong to that group. Manual match can be used in case the invoice comes in and it is not tied to the correct purchase order. Perhaps there was an error on the vendor side, in which case you can use the manual match button and search for and tie this invoice to the correct purchase order. When you do so, the reconciliation will recalculate accordingly. In this case, though, I'm going to go directly to the exception to take an action. And you'll notice that on the right-hand side, I have a couple options here. I have a tax code drop-down where I could change the tax code if I want to. And I also have an action drop-down. And if I click the action drop-down for this tax exception, you can see that I'm able to accept the tax amount. So even though I know that it's too much, I can accept it and allow it to go through. I can accept the expected tax amount instead. That means I'm actually disputing what they sent me, and I'm only agreeing to pay what was expected based on the original PO. Or I can defer to someone else. That is just like the refer function we saw at the top. You're able to send this exception to somebody else for exception handling. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and accept the tax amount. So when I click accept, you'll notice that I have a green box here that says the tax amount was accepted. I also have now the buttons at the top have changed, and now there are fewer options now that I've accepted the exception, and I can submit my changes. So I'm going to go ahead and submit my changes, and it tells me the invoice is now reconciled, and I can view the status of my IR now.
you'll notice that when you approve as a member of a group, it not only will keep the group name in the approval flow graph, but it will put the actual person, the actual member of the group, it will represent their name as well. So we can see that Chad Knoll took care of this on behalf of the tax manager group. Notice now that instead of our IR being in reconciling status, if it's going through reconciliation, or approving status if it's going through approvals, we've taken care of the only issue here. So now it is in paying status. Paying status means we've cleared any issues and have okayed this for payment. Periodically, there will be a batch process that runs behind the scenes to look for all such invoices, and it will put them into our export to send to your ERP system. That export is called the OK to Pay file, and now this is ready to go into that export. If I go to my History tab, you can see a history of the IR, and again, every document in Ariba has its own history tab, so you have a full audit trail. And if I go to back to my reference tab, you can see now, in addition to my purchase order, my receipts, and my invoice, I have a payment document. This is the final step of our end-to-end process. Now that we've cleared this for payment, the next time our export runs, it will send this to our ERP system. Our ERP system will then issue a payment, and if we have the remittance interface set up between Ariba and your ERP will send Ariba back the remittance information. That is what in turn will populate the payment document. So you can see already, based on the PO, it's populated a few things such as the net due date, the schedule date. We had some discounts that applied to the supplier, so those were calculated automatically. And in the end, this is how much of a payment, $36.98, that we're going to issue to the vendor. This is going to be paid via check based on our payment methods, and this is scheduled for payment. It has not gone across yet. Once we get the remittance interface back from the ERP, this will change from paying status to paid status, now that we know a payment has been issued, and the transaction column would fill in and populate your check number or your voucher number or other payment method. This way we can keep Ariba and your ERP in sync. You can also click into the payment document to see its details. And again, it just has a summary of how the payment is made, how much was approved, if there was any discounts that applied. In this case, there was $1 or $2 worth of discounts. And then the difference between the two is the amount we're finally paying. So it gives you a full summary, as well as in this case, it will be paid via check through our Citibank account. And then the receiving bank is listed as well. So again, this is the full payment summary. The other advantage of the remittance interface is it will not just update Ariba, but if your vendor is on the Ariba network, it will send the payment information to Ariba network as well, so your vendor is also updated. And that concludes the end-to-end demonstration of Ariba Procure to Pay. Hopefully you have a good sense now of how the system works, beginning with a purchase requisition, submitting that for approval. Once that's fully approved, it creates an associated purchase order. That purchase order is dispatched to the vendor. Once they fulfill the order, we can key in a goods receipt. Eventually, the vendor will bill us and send us an invoice. That will come into the system and make two copies, as we saw, an INV copy, invoice copy, and an IR copy, which is the invoice reconciliation. Only once any discrepancies on the invoice are cleared via our reconciliation process and reconciliation engine, then and only then is the invoice cleared for payment. And again, the final stop is to generate this payment document with a PAY prefix and to actually interface with your ERP to ensure that a payment is issued. And then to finally ensure both Ariba and the Ariba network, if it is a network vendor, are updated. Thank you for listening to this recording.